Hi, this is Craig Kramer, and today is July 19th, 2018. Today I'm pleased to have with me Jim Bernazzani. He is a retired FBI agent. How are you, Jim?
Very good, Craig. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. What are you doing right now?
I'm an adjunct professor at Tulane University School of Professional Advancement, centering on Homeland and Emergency Security Studies.
Okay. And I wanted to talk to you. I've interviewed you once not too long ago about national security issues. And there's a lot of talk about President Donald Trump and Russia and Putin. Do you consider this to be a political issue? I have a lot of friends that say, look, this is just the Democrats trying to say, make excuses for the loss or try to attack Donald Trump in some way to make him look bad. Is this a political issue or an American issue?
This is a national security issue. What President Putin is doing right now is administering a very effective active measure. And an active measure basically is a dirty trick used by the intelligence community. And the active measure is based upon mistruths and misrepresentation designed to fracture the societal community of the United States, and it's working.
Why is it called active measure?
Because it is basically, once you set an active measure in motion, it remains active and it loses the control of the person who initiated. Right now, President Putin is reaping benefits that he did not intend to receive. And the most positive for the government of Russia and to the chagrin of the United States of America. This active measure, this dirty trick by the Russians, began with the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. And originally, and the media bought into this, there was a perception from the American intelligence community, who knew better, by the way, that this was solely an attack on Clinton to help Trump be elected. Once President Trump became President-elect Trump, this active measure turned on President Trump. Now, again, all Putin and his cyber skullduggery people in St. Petersburg and Moscow had to do was to find platforms to impersonate Americans and send messages. And those legitimate platforms, nobly intended, would forward those messages on to their constituency and basically irrigate the fields with the Russian message. Now, early on, when you heard about Lock Hillary Up, that was part of that active measure that was born by the Russians, sent to the appropriate political establishments who irrigated the fields for the Russians. The Russians built their plausible deniability.
And then the Americans took over and did their job.
Exactly right. They became the irrigators of the field. The Russians were hands off, let this active measure take root unto its own. And this active measure assumed a life of its own. Well, when everybody was reporting that this was an attack on Hillary Clinton, this active measure then turned on President-elect Trump. And if you remember the sayings that Trump is not my president, they gained traction. That was this active measure attacking other platforms that not necessarily were in line with the ambitions and the intentions of President-elect Trump. This is not an attack on Clinton. This is not an attack on Trump. This is an attack on the American democratic system.
They targeted both the Democrats and the Republicans to turn on themselves to do their work.
To split our society, pitch one against the other, the Democrats against the Republicans. And all the Russians did was sit back with the most cost-effective wedge and watch it play unto itself and hopefully watch, in their eyes, the United States implode.
Now, the Russians have been meddling in our elections in some way or another for many years, right?
Yes. So the former Soviet Union is steeped in intrigue and espionage that basically shapes Putin's mind, where he sees the United States as a democracy in decline. And he's exploiting what he perceives to be Mr. Trump's Achilles heels, ego and credulity, wanting to be friends with Putin. And Putin has taken advantage of this. And conversely, Mr. Putin looks at this as his authoritarian system that he is presiding over as advancing. And they launched this most effective black operation, this active measure, which again are bearing unintended consequences, both for the Trump administration and the Putin administration.
I thought that this was all going to benefit Putin, but you said there was a moment in time when Putin was getting worried.
Well, once this active measure took hold, the Russians lost control of it. And when we saw the fracture within the Trump administration, we saw some people leave the administration. And much to Putin's chagrin, fellows like Mr. Bolton, who's a hawk, and Mr. Pompeo, who moved from CIA to Department of State, Secretary of State, take those positions, all of a sudden Putin had an administration that was a little bit more hawkish than he originally had. But as this active measure continued, the benefits swung back in his favor. And to be quite frank, when you measure risk versus gain, Mr. Putin has gained.
Is it fair to say we're under attack by Russia?
Absolutely. The difference between active measures that were utilized during the Cold War, during the 50s and 60s, and the active measures today are the means of delivery. The old days, the active measure was seeded in the American psyche through newspaper articles, usually European articles that international wire services would pick up, like the old AP and UPI. And they would transfer into the U.S. print medium, and Americans would read them. Now, with the explosion of the internet, the method of delivery is much quicker and much more efficient. The impact can almost be immediate. But that's very important to understand this impact. This impact is not an immediate impact. This impact of an effective active measure is death by 1,000 cuts. And we got to wake up. And the greatest defense to defend against this offense, this active measure, is an educated American populace that understands these guys, these Russians, our adversary, are taking runs at us. We know better. This is nothing more than an active measure.
So you say death by 1,000 cuts. Can you give me some examples of how the average person might eventually see some impacts against our society, against our economy? How is this going to manifest itself?
Well, active measures are not to the sole inclusion of foreign policy and national security. It is used in international business too. And when you drive these wedges, you will affect, in a negative standpoint, the consumer price index. And you'll begin to see United States consumers paying more money out of their pocket for items that were previously a lot less expensive. And that takes time, but we're going to begin to see that. And unfortunately,
jump in here for a minute. Is this independent of trade issues and tariffs and such?
Well, that's a very good point. It's used in conjunction, in unison, with normal trade negotiations. An active measure is a leverage piece. It is not the only mechanism, the only engine unto itself. It supplements already ongoing negotiations, usually for the benefit of the individual who initiated that active measure. Active measures are now on steroids, and we've got to wake up. This is a threat curve that we have to be ahead of. And again, the only way that we can be ahead of it is be knowledgeable of what exactly an active measure is, how it works, and see through the manipulation, the misrepresentation, the subterfuge of our adversaries, in this case, the Russian government. You know, the stage is an American stage that's being attacked. It's not just the Democratic stage or the Republican stage. This is an American stage that's being attacked. And we as Americans have to come together. This is an active warfare technique. An active measure is nothing more than information warfare. It has been weaponized tremendously by the explosion of the internet.
Okay, this is going to sound political, but I've got to ask it. When you looked at the performance of Donald Trump, our president, next to Putin, the president of Russia, and you look at how he behaved.
Who's he?
Thank you. Donald Trump, our president, how he behaved. Is it fair and reasonable to say that he's actually promoting Putin's agenda?
I think what you saw was an exercise in deference, where there was, I wouldn't want to call it humble submission, but it was definitely a respect that Mr. Trump showed to Mr. Putin that was genuine. But on the other hand, I believe the respect that Mr. Putin showed Mr. Trump was part of this misrepresentation campaign. I don't trust Putin. He's KGB. Some people may not trust me. I'm FBI. But I'll tell you right now, when you're in the spy games, this is something we both know, and the United States intelligence community knew what was going on. Unfortunately, the administration didn't agree with it.
Donald Trump has, for many, many months now, before he was president, talked about how the intelligence community was not to be trusted, that their information was not accurate, and they went on and on and on and basically tried to, I think, convince people that our intelligence community didn't know what they were doing, and that seems to continue to be his message. Would you agree with that?
I think what you are seeing is the fruits of a very effective active measure in the sense that it has put the United States on the defensive, proving a negative. An effective active measure builds in plausible deniability. This Russian active measure, you have to hand it to Putin and his cronies. It was executed magnificently. This is one of the most professional active measures I've seen in a long, long time. And if you look at the legs that this active measure is gaining, it's been around since 2016 and is still paying dividends for the Russians. We have got to wake up and call it what it is. It is a dirty trick by Russian intelligence, and to be quite frank, we bit.
Mm-hmm. So how should we as the American public have confidence and believe what you're saying and believe the intelligence community when our president says it's a witch hunt?
Read the indictments from Director Mueller's investigation. There are two public from Director Mueller's investigation, and one from the Washington field office relative to a female who was acting on behalf of Russian intelligence to establish relationships with other platforms that eventually could be used in this active measure. And then the American people are smart. Take a look at it for yourself. There's plenty of information out there. Check out what an active measure is. Check out this whole so-called meddling in U.S. presidential elections. This meddling in U.S. presidential elections is the active measure, and it's continuing to pay dividends.
So what I hear you telling me is that you hope that the American people can see through this, whereas the President of the United States does not.
I wouldn't go that far. I know the American people can see this. The American people are smart people. They're intelligent people. They are capable of independent thought. That is one of the foundations of this great nation. To exercise independent thought, to draft the ability to conceptualize it, understand what is really going on. Take an objective look at this. Pull yourself out of the Democratic Party. Pull yourself out of the Republican Party. Pull yourself out of an independent. Get into the part of the American society and take a look at this. Our adversary, Putin, is taking us to the cleaners right now. And he's sitting back with his cronies in Russia, high-fiving, just watching this thing take on a life of its own. He doesn't have to do anything any more than have a few sound bites in the press. The platforms that this active measure have landed on, which in turn is irrigated by nobly intended individuals of those organizations to spread this information, is actually the misrepresentation and subterfuge that Putin intended to spread among the society, which is quite cost-effective. It's just on the internet.
It's really complicated because...
Actually, it's really simple.
Okay, go ahead.
Take a look at it. Take a look at the facts as you understand them and take a look what's being said. In the final analysis, Craig, it's the fruits of the derivative tree. Where did this information come from? Qualify the original source. Once you qualify that original source, wherever it went is removed from that original source and can be interpreted and spun in a particular way. But try to find where that platform originated, that message, and from there irrigated the American fields.
And I would think that you would probably agree that it's not just social media, but it's the cable media, cable network, if you will, and regular broadcast TV. Do they play a role in this?
They are also the unwitting individuals who get their information from the internet and wire services. The fruits of the derivative tree. The source, the original source of the information. That embryo has sprung a life that is damaging the American society. And we have to, this is more brains over brawn as opposed to the old Cold War brawn over brains. This is not bullets and bombs. This is information warfare. This is gigabytes in the internet. And we have to outsmart Putin and his cronies. And by the way, The Russians are not the only nation state to utilize active measures. The Chinese are very good at it. The Iranians are very good at it. And to be quite frank, the United States has participated in this type of skullduggery also.
Okay, so at the end of the day, what does Putin want out of this?
Global stature, bring Russia back to the noble pinnacle of the old former Soviet Union. Become more world power on the world stage. And right now, Russia can't do that because their economy is tanking. Putin's, I think his main objective is right now is while fracturing the American society, he's going to fracture probably the strongest and most historically sound alliance that the earth has ever known. That's NATO. And we're seeing that right now also. This active measure is paying dividends. Like I said, it was I believe, totally unintended in the mind of Putin. And he's sitting back going, he's watching this black art just flourish to his benefit and the detriment of the United States.
Explain it a little bit. Why is NATO important?
It's an alliance, a military alliance that can check those nation states whose systems of order, their governance, are inimical to those of the United States and the West. Simple as that. And if NATO gets fractured, then we have a much more difficult time impeding a hot war, which was when bullets and bombs are flying. This is a new Cold War. This is the old Cold War that's been weaponized with the internet. It's pure and simple.
Is it fair to say that someone who is a staunch Republican can understand this and agree to it and still support President Donald Trump in other issues? This isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You can still support him
Correct.
On other issues, right?
Yeah. That is a very good point you make, Craig, that this is not the only game in town. Putin wishes it was. But if we don't check this, if we don't stop this, it's going to affect other areas, other sectors in our society. And pretty soon it's going to be somewhat overwhelming. But again, we can do this. We're smart enough to do it. The United States intelligence community, you got to give them a lot of credit. Figure this thing out early on. Their problem was the apparent method of delivery. Because when those briefings went to the power brokers to pull the levers of decisions for the national security of this country, there wasn't total buy-in. And hopefully there will be now. There have been other countries that have been victimized by these active measures. There were attempts in Britain with the election. There were attempts to our friends in the south of us in Mexico with these active measures. And it's not going to go away. And the litmus test for the American people will be the midterm elections. We had better get smart relative to the run-up to these midterm elections and understand and qualify some bombastic statement made by somebody. Where did you get that? And find the fruit of that derivative tree. Conduct the appropriate analysis and understand where it came from. And if in fact it is an active measure, it's from our adversaries.
Yeah.
This I'm trying to pull this out of the political landscape and put it where it should be. This is an interest of national security. Regardless if you're from the political left, the political right, or you're a centrist. We are all Americans and we are all under assault right now.
Well, it's simple, but it's challenging.
Absolutely. And we are only bound by our own abilities to understand the threat and to conduct an analysis that's necessary to identify roads to push back on this effort and move forward. But this is not our last rodeo. This is one that's been most effective because elements of the platforms that were utilized by two entities, DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, were quite effective in getting the message to the appropriate people who in turn irrigated the fields for them. Unwitting American patriots that thought they were doing the right thing when actually they were being used too.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that sanctions against Russia play a role in trying to stop them?
That could be tangible. I mean, the fact that if the Russian economy begins to tank worse than it is now, the Russian people aren't stupid either. They're going to see prices at the stores. They're going to see lack of products on their tables. And they're going to ask why. You know, it's nice to have a victory But it's our intent, and I hope our intent, to shorten the life of this victory and put the mindset of the Russian people back on their own quality of life and ask themselves, what the heck is happening here? Where is our leadership? Yeah, we had a great month of July, but that was 6 months ago. And right now, life's not that good.
Well, Jim, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to comment on or talk about?
I'd just like to reemphasize that the American people are very resilient and strong people. We got kicked, but we weren't knocked down. We were woken up. And I'll tell you right now, if you don't understand the difference between politics and national security, you're going to be Putin's best customer. Pull yourself out of your Republican mindset. Pull yourself out of the Democratic mindset, that independent mindset, and put yourself into the American mindset. We are all in this together. And if we can extract ourselves from politics and understand that this is a legitimate black operation and attack on United States values, then Putin wins and we lose.